We were very interested in questions about preparation of business professionals, but noticed that most studies really focused on the master's level. So there is a lot of research on the MBA around the world, but not very much about undergraduate business education. The book, Rethinking Undergraduate Business Education, was really a kind of write-up, but also a thinking through what we found in that study. Business students were judged by faculty in the arts and sciences as standing out because of certain kinds of performance skill. So they were typically more polished in their ability to make a presentation. They all were really expert at PowerPoint. They could, reduce complex, or at least they could reduce long pieces of text to bullet points, things like that. But the faculty also noted that business students were made very uncomfortable when there were, let's say, complex questions posed about the presentation. Business faculty tended to think of communication, for example, and the associated ideas as simply a kind of scripted performance. They didn't think of it in the way that particularly humanities faculty tended to think of communication as a way to actually learn things. And that really seemed to be a major dividing line between these approaches. So that what we really hope to do with the book is to expand the notion of what performance means. So the performance doesn't simply mean to enact a script or to carry out a strategic intervention. It can also mean the ability to, back to that question about the goals or purposes of learning, it can also be the ability to demonstrate a capacity to think in certain ways, to apply knowledge, and also to criticize knowledge. The approach that we took in the book was to always begin with the question of what are the outcomes, the intended outcomes of any particular educational experience. This is a question that professors often don't spend a lot of time thinking about, that they often see their role as simply providing coverage of the material or the approaches of a given discipline without asking that particular question. What is it you expect students to be able to think? How do you expect them to be able to think? What do you expect them to be able to do when they've completed a course or a curriculum? So if you take that as a first question, then it becomes logical and fairly easy, I think, to imagine that you then have to align the curriculum, the sequence of educational experiences which you want to propose students go through, with those goals, the outcomes. And then in turn, it becomes possible to ask questions, how most effectively can you do that? So within this kind of a curriculum where students will study, let us say, finance and accounting and marketing and management, but you also want them to be studying things that are brought up here as in contextual studies. If that's your curriculum, then what are really the most effective ways of enabling students to develop in those forms of knowledge or skill? And those are the questions of pedagogy. If you think that you've identified the proper goals, if you also think that you have a well-structured sequence of experiences aimed at those goals, and furthermore you believe that you've really identified and can deliver effective means of learning for students, the actual pedagogy or teaching function, how do you know you're succeeding? So the question of assessment and how to use assessment is another issue that we spent some time on. The programs were probably pretty effective in providing students with different kinds of tools they would need for employment in business. But they didn't do a lot about enabling students to understand the role of business, for example, in society. They didn't spend a lot of time enabling students to think critically and carefully about the kind of identity that they might want to assume, the kinds of roles they might want to play in business, in part because there was so little attention to the context of business itself. So our first big finding really was to argue that that's not good enough for higher education that's going to prepare professionals for business in the 21st century in a global economy. And it's not good enough for giving students this kind of undergraduate experience which can suit them for lives in the 21st century.